Fab. So it's really nice to be here. Thank you for the invitation. Jayne and I are going to talk today about a fairly new project. So this project, Towards Toddlerhood, Reframing Toddlers and Their Development Through the Arts, is a 2-year project funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council in the UK. And we're 6 months into it. So it feels really exciting and like we're at a really early stage. And what we thought we'd do for this seminar is we'll talk a little bit about what the project hopes to achieve, our rationale for coupling toddlerhood with the arts, with post-developmental perspectives, and why we think that's really important. And then in the second part of the seminar, we're going to give you some concrete examples of how that's looked so far during the project, how those things have kind of come together as an axis, and some examples of the sorts of insights and the sorts of ideas that we think this work is generating for us so far. Like I say, it's in a really early stage. First time we formally talked about this project anywhere. So that's really nice. It'd be really lovely to hear people's comments and suggestions and feedback as well at the end. So first of all, what's the project? The project is about collaboration. It's primarily about building a network of researchers, artists, and educators to advance or to try to further delineate this idea of a post-developmental view of toddlers and toddlerhood. And in doing that, we're hoping to interrogate exclusionary discourses and practices that are often associated with this idea of normal development and milestones and developmental theory. And we're doing that by asking this question: how can arts practice generate critical conversations with and alternative understandings of toddlerhood? So that's the really broad kind of research question that's driving the inquiry. And as you can see from this slide, Jayne and I are here today, but we're representing a much bigger collective. So we're working across 3 locations in the UK, working in South Yorkshire, represented by Sheffield Hallam University, in Manchester with Man Met, and then in London as well via Middlesex University. And as well as bringing together the research team, so we have myself and Jill in South Yorkshire, Rachel Holmes and Christina McRae at Man Met, and then Jayne and Vicar at Middlesex. Part of the project is around employing project artists. You can see their names on the slides as well, Ruth and Anna and Kitty and Sohei. And then we're also working in partnership with non-academic project partners, largely from the cultural and arts sector, who, as you can see on the slide, are there. And that's a really important part of the project as well. So I'm going to start by giving a little overview about how we see those jigsaw pieces all fitting together and where we hope that fitting together will get us. So the idea is that we bring together researchers, artists and practitioners to work with and think about what we are terming motifs of toddlerhood. So these are themes of everyday life or hot topics that are really pertinent in the lives of toddlers and those who look after or work with toddlers, but also become loaded with societal expectation around the idea of the young developing child and what they are not yet. So I'm going to talk a little bit more in a minute, more on that later, about what these motifs are and how they're looking so far in the project. So the purpose of the project is to bring together this network of artists, practitioners, researchers, those working in the cultural and arts section, and together spark new ideas about development, what alternatives we could think of in relation to that. And something that unites really all of those strands of work is this question: what would an artful rather than a developmental toddlerhood look like? So we're very much grounded in that idea of the what else, or how could we think otherwise around these questions.
So this is me. Is it me or you?
No, it's still me.
It's still you. Okay, it's got my name.
So just to give further overview about the shape of the project, it's got 3 key objectives. The first one is around these workshops that we're going to convene, and we have convened 2 of them already, around these sort of motifs of toddlerhood, or these important topics that impact toddler life and those who work with toddlers and look after toddlers, and are largely viewed through the lens of development. So these are the themes on this slide. We've got moving, feeding, tantruming, sleeping, and then language and communication. So the first of the 3 objectives of the project is that we're convening a workshop themed around each of these topics, one after the other, bringing together our network of those in research and arts practice and those who work with young children to think collaboratively with an arts-led or an arts-based lens about how we can question assumptions or consider what else gets overlooked or marginalised within these themes. And we're going to give some examples of what that looks like in the second half of this paper. Also within this work, these workshop gatherings, I want to emphasise the importance of the cultural and arts partners that we're working with. Those partners are hosting each of the workshops in really different kinds of spaces, and the spaces themselves feel really important. It felt really important that we were paying attention to the physicality of the space that we met in. So for example, for the movement workshop, that one's already happened. We met in a theatre space. The feeding workshop, we met in a former stately home that's now a community museum in South Yorkshire. So the physicality of the spaces, but all the sort of discourses and ideas and arts practices underpinning those spaces also feel like a really important part of the conversation, something that we definitely want to think more about. But absolutely from the beginning, we knew that we wanted to meet in spaces that felt more arts and culture and community grounded and less classroomy. So that's the first of the 3 strands of the project. The second one is that we are working in partnership with earlier settings in each of our 3 locations. So in London, in Manchester, in South Yorkshire, working with toddlers and their families. And this was our solution for how to make sure that we weave in and centre the voices and the ways of being of toddlers and their family members themselves, but without kind of bringing families into the academic workshop spaces in a way that we worried would either feel tokenistic or would just feel not necessarily comfortable for the toddlers themselves. So instead, we have this as a second strand, and the research team are going to be working with the earlier settings, bringing these themes, so the moving, the feeding, the sleeping, etc., into those spaces, and creating hopefully a 2-way dialogue between the families in their community spaces and these workshop gatherings that were the first objective. This works at a really early stage and is something that might be really interesting to discuss in the Q&A section, particularly because I think it's going to look different in each of the 3 locations as well. I think it's going to be very much shaped by the families and the groups that we've chosen to work with and their needs. That might be something interesting to talk more about. And then thirdly, the third objective of the project is to author and launch a report for policymakers and stakeholders regarding the potential of this post-developmental view of toddlerhood to inform how families are engaged with or supported. So this idea of the pragmatic and having real-world impact and informing policy and practice is really important to us in this project, despite the fact that the project is grounded in materiality, in the arts, in lived experience, in very experimental methodologies, and in post-human theories. And these are all things that rarely take centre stage when it comes to how early years policy is informed and enacted in the UK. However, what we're hoping to explore in this project is how do we make visible really grounded and pragmatic alternative approaches for how we might respond to and support families and communities, for example, within education or health or community engagement, that kind of leak and sit more outside of this kind of dominant lens of development. So overall, we're hoping that our work will, via arts-led methods, pose challenging and awkward questions and provocations that question this idea of developmentalism and its linear certainties. Our aim is that by situating discussions of toddlers within this very cross-disciplinary and arts-led scholarship would be able to generate some new thinking, particularly about the complexity of toddlerhood, and also begin to grapple with the challenge of how do we understand early childhood outside of the frame of the individual, outside of a single generation, and also outside of biological legacy. So what then is our motivation for seeking alternative understandings of toddler? And I'm also aware that I keep using this term post-developmental. What do we think, or what do we hope that term kind of carries or might open up for us? So young children have historically been and continue to be considered mostly through the lens of development, certainly in the UK, and we know elsewhere. That is, there's an emphasis on childhood as a series of transitional stages measured by generalizable linear progress, and that's mapped against age and capacity and ability. And important within the narrative of development are milestones that either signify normal development or prompt intervention to kind of correct the trajectory. Overall development, certainly in the context we're working in, has become such a dominant context for thinking about toddlers that it's often viewed as natural or common sense, and even questioning it is often something new in a lot of the spaces that we're working in. So in our research, we assert that viewing toddlers predominantly as developing risks denying the complexity and the variety of young children's lives. Developmental theories evolved originally with white, middle-class, Western children in mind. They're frequently underpinned explicitly by data sets that are exclusively of white, Western, middle-class children. So they've long positioned working class and racialized families, or those with neurodivergent or disabled children, as inadequate or in need of fixing. Developmental assessments persistently position disabled, working class, and children of colour as a deficit. And so these theories also have very real world and sometimes severe consequences. Children, for example, might be subject to lower expectations, or families might experience heightened surveillance under this developmentalist logic. So really in this project, we're seeking to address this by widening debates about how development situates different children differently, and what alternatives, such as, for example, the post-developmental lens, can offer. Whilst all children, arguably, sit within neoliberal temporalities, surveillance, and the drive for progress, normality, and the spectre of the future economic citizen that this child is supposed to become, for us, toddlers are a particularly pertinent and important space to be asking this question. So when we think about young people who are roughly between, say, the ages of 1 and 3 years old, and of course, how ironic it is that we struggle to define the beings we speak of outside of biological age, or of course, outside of the moniker of toddler, which of course refers to a non-adult mode of mobility. Toddlers' learning and well-being in particular comes to be viewed through the lens of biology and development. It quickly becomes stickily mired in science, and so it's particularly challenging to fray that or to think otherwise. Early language, for example, an area that I'm really interested in, it's really difficult to speak of outside of a dominant developmental psychological view of language acquisition, and also the mountains of random control trial data sets that stack one on the other to declare what is normal or what counts as progress in relation to how children use language. How can we then begin to open up a lens to talk about what's getting overlooked or marginalized or erased in the lives of young children, in the lives of different communities by this? And we're hoping that an arts-led approach will offer something new that offers a real sense, a real kind of potential to unsettle and story differently. So I'm going to pass over to Jayne now to talk a bit about what this is looking like in the project.
Thanks, Abby. Yeah, so as you'll have noticed, we're talking in the project about toddlerhood as a phenomenon, as a kind of happening, and thinking about that in processual terms. So we've termed our intervention toddlerhood in order to dwell in spaces beyond certainty and temporalities otherwise assumed by child development. So our arts-based approaches are grounded in materiality, embodiment, and playfulness. And playfulness actually is a really welcome thing, but it also is a source of great discomfort for adults being playful with movement and uncertainty and their bodies. But this has really helped us to adopt and attune to what Hannah Dyer refers to as the child's emotional illegibility, queer intimacies, and affective intensities. So we're situating discussions of toddlers within a cross-disciplinary scholarship, and by doing so generate new thinking about the complexity of toddlerhood, questioning those common sense assumptions and the kind of entrenched ideas that have it framed by developmentalism. So I think we're on the next slide. Are we? Yes. And then we move to some of what we did. And here's a little glimpse, little window into the movement workshop. And our kind of guiding question for this workshop was to think, what does art do? What does art make possible? And in this particular set of images, we're thinking with and enacting wobbling and falling, and this and the in-betweenness of the thing. So this idea of not getting anywhere, because obviously the emphasis on toddler development is this idea of linear progress in a forward trajectory. But what happens if you dwell in the in-betweenness, and the very idea of what happens when you're not striving for forward trajectories? So during the movement workshop, we thought about the kinds of movement that defy the linear forward march of progress, not getting anywhere, stillness, and in fact moving backwards and falling over, which was not available to all of us actually. But we wondered how bodily experiences of these kinds of movement might help us to foreground the why of movement rather than the what. That is usually of such great concern when children's development progress is mapped. Are they crawling yet? Are they walking yet? Have they taken the first steps? Rolling, all the things that children should be able to do in terms of movement, and that then marks them as normal or not. So the artists we were working with in this workshop, Anna MacDonald and Kitty Winter, offered us a number of somatic scores for us to experiment with. Including moving whilst being aware of the space and moving whilst keeping equidistant from others. And it was actually deceptively difficult and really unnerving and unsettling. And I think for those of us who aren't dancers or movement artists, then it really was quite a tough ask to kind of be in that state of the in-betweenness. And we were invited to participate in a series of wobbling exercises. And of course, when you think of the toddler, there's the toddling, but there's also the wobbling. So we were thinking about wobbling together, and also how that then engendered the other person as being your scaffolding or your support. And it also, this wobbling together and around, emphasized the anticipatory nature of the wobble. We kind of know, or we imagine what might happen. And of course, then Anna invited us to sit with the discomfort of the moment of stillness in between each back and forth movement, which became of heightened significance. So we were tuning into our bodily engagement with the wobble in ways that we probably have never done, actually. So wobbling in a group, supporting others and depending on them for safety, challenged ideas of physical autonomy that we find embedded in the Ages and Stages assessment questionnaire. So the questions such as, does your child walk either up or down at least 2 steps by herself? Does your child run fairly well, stopping herself without bumping into things or falling over? Those seemingly benign questions suddenly came into sharp focus through this act of wobbling and becoming together in the in-between. So then we move on to the next workshop, where we were offered a breadstick apple banana score by Anna in this particular, these photos here. So this was about feeding, and this was thinking about the role of food, what else food is, what else food does. And we experimented with the effective forces generated by unyielding and coordinating eating rules through a series of scores led by Anna, in which we tried to synchronize our bodies, firstly by walking together and then by eating together. So you can kind of see us in this large circle here. Abby opted for the banana, I took the apple, and others took the breadstick. And then we stood in this circle and kind of really deeply concentrated on synchronizing ourselves, which was actually much harder than you would imagine. And it was a thoroughly uncanny experience. We were watching and being watched, which is often the experience of a toddler, being highly surveyed at meal times and snack times. And as we ate the breadsticks, the apples and the bananas in an attempt at unison, we were trying to bite, chew and finish at the same time. Part of what we experienced during these exercises was a foregrounding of the bodily process of eating, which often goes unnoticed. So it is this kind of heightened awareness of the act of eating or feeding, and also the texture of food in one's mouth, and the mechanics of biting and chewing and so on. Anna cautioned us, choose your apple or breadstick carefully. It is literally about to become part of you. And in many senses, the food hailed us, and then it worked on us in ways that we couldn't have necessarily anticipated. So, for example, I had not realized how difficult it is to eat an apple quickly. It's very wet and it's very chewy, and has a completely different tempo to a breadstick, which is surprisingly claggy and crumbly. And so the food was actually enabling and disabling our capacities to eat in unison. So the encounter underlined that toddlerhood is formed of encounters, processes, and is always relational. Or as Maurice Sendak implores in The Night Kitchen, I'm in the milk and the milk's in me, one and the same machine, persistently in symbiosis. I think I hand over to you now, Abby.
Yeah, I'm going to provide a third example, and it's also from the feeding workshop. So we've done the two so far, moving and feeding. Our third one, tantruming, is coming up in January. Here's another example. When we started to unpack this idea of feeding and what are other ways of thinking about feeding in relation to toddlerhood and arts practice that aren't commonly centered when we think about toddler development and feeding, we started to identify how, through the lens of the developing child, feeding is often viewed as a kind of civilizing project. The young child needs to be shaped to behave in a more civilized way as time passes. And perhaps particularly with feeding, there's a really heightened sense of like the risk of that, because food is messy, but it also disrupts the boundaries of the body, which, as we'll go on to explore in this section, is really disruptive to these imaginaries of like the bounded, autonomous human. So feeding feels like this kind of risky space in toddler development, a space where young children need to be shaped to behave in more civilized ways as time passes. They need to be encultured to eat nicely. As Deborah Alban has pointed out, there can even be a kind of process of over-civilizing where rules are applied even more rigidly to young children and in quite extreme ways. So, for example, very set scheduled eating times in early year settings, chairs tucked really tightly under the table, so children are kind of required to stay and not sort of wriggle off the seat. And even kind of limited access to drinking water, Albin describes in some earlier settings. So this kind of regimented and unified sort of sense of what it means to eat nicely is something that we were playing with in the breadstick apple banana experiment that Jayne described. Keelan and colleagues point out that practices such as partitioning food time off from other times of the day, like playtime, and coupling it with very specific bodily practices like sitting at the table and using cutlery, have a long and messy colonial history of being presented as natural or superior modes of feeding. So all of this is, of course, extremely political. I want to come back now to the idea of the human as kind of contained and bounded, though, and think about what feeding does to generatively unravel some of that. So humans in general, and children in particular through a developmental lens, are often assumed to be kind of contained and separate from each other with clear and impermeable boundaries. And again, there's this kind of sense of abstractability. So at various points during early childhood in the UK, children's development is kind of assessed against milestones using checklists. And those kinds of assessments are very much grounded in the idea of an abstractable child. So what you assess the child as being able to do now is the same as what they would be able to do in a couple of hours' time. And it's the same in this location as in that location. So place and like the relational don't really figure strongly in those kinds of assessments. That's something that we're really interested in. So, for example, the child's body and the child's brain are both imagined as these kind of separate containers, and the focus is enduringly on the child as the individual and on evaluating what do we find inside the container. How do we measure or assess its contents? How could we add or modify or improve what we find in the container? And from this perspective, the development of the individual child always belongs only to them. We've explored in the project so far the myriad ways this logic falls apart across many different contexts, but feeding is perhaps a particularly striking example of this. We can view feeding as a process of human exchange and growth with the more than human world. It's just a very uncomfortable way for a lot of people of framing what's going on here. This exchange and growing with is the foundation of all living organisms' development, arguably. So we can think about respiration, metabolism, composting, learning, arguably. As Tim Ingold writes, things can exist and persist only because they leak. As Anna MacDonald, our artist, pointed out in the apple banana breadstick activity, choose your piece of food carefully. It's about to become part of you. So we also came to think about these processes of leaky growing in relation to what we, as the workshop participants, were doing and our collective engagement with ideas and materialities during the workshop. So during this day, we talked, we experimented, we did the activities, we thought about them, we ate. You can see in this picture, we had a really lovely shared meal halfway through the day. And then after the meal, we invited the group to digest. So to walk after lunch, to wander, to turn over the ideas from the morning in our minds, and then come back together and share where we might think we have collectively got to. Because certainly by the end of the workshop, we had got somewhere together. That place might not be comfortable. It might involve more questions than answers. And it was certainly unlikely to be a neat conclusion or a group consensus. Inspired by Rikahotti and Tura Tami, I was interested in thinking about the ideas and questions and uncertainties and emotions and our full bellies of the beautiful food as a kind of composting in which all kinds of elements cluster together, interact, partially combine, and create something new, potentially something nourishing and generative for the future. So to further unpack how I we're seeing that looking in some of these workshops. I'm going to share some reflections from one of our other co-researchers, Christina McRae, about what emerged during the day, and particularly what emerged in this final part of the feeding workshop, where we invited people to share where they thought we had got to as a group, to share reflections and questions and ideas. And people could do that in whatever mode was comfortable for them. So people could talk around the table, but they could also write and make notes, or they could sketch and draw. They were also invited to make and to interact with both craft materials and food items that were in the room during the day at that point. So this is Christina's reflection, interacting with bread. And the item that she's describing is the big image on this screen. This is Christina's reflections. She says, I found myself being drawn to the white bread in its plastic cover. I became conscious that faced with all the fruit on the table, I had a niggle about creating an artifact that would involve wasting food that could otherwise be eaten. My thoughts returned to an earlier conversation with another participant about why we focus our anxieties particularly on wasting food when there are so many other resources that also get wasted in the process of everyday life and in early childhood education, and don't receive this sort of level of scrutiny and anxiety. I mused the white bread likely has little more nutritional content than cardboard, and how strange it was I felt so uneasy to waste the bread by playing with it. I still couldn't quite shake off this feeling, so this led me to choose the end of the bread, because I know this part is often discarded because it's all crust. As soon as I started to pull out the spongy bread with my fingers, memories of food play as a child came back to me. I remembered in particular a strange ritual I had when I was very young eating chicken. I would break it into smaller pieces and enjoy the strange way it could feel sticky against my teeth as I opened and shut my teeth, biting down and unbiting. I remember consciously biting into the chicken pieces slowly, not to swallow the food, but to increase the odd feeling that my teeth were momentarily stuck together, the internal squeak and release when the teeth opened from the bite. I would always push a few pieces of chicken to the edge of my plate to save them until last. At the same time as these thoughts interrupted me, I'd continue fingering the doughy bread, and I was aware it was almost like Play-Doh, something that I could mold. I found myself thinking about still life paintings of bowls of fruit, and tinged with this image was also the thought about healthy eating messages that families receive, such as eat your 5 a day, fruit and veg. I kneaded out a bowl with the breaded dough, and then I rolled a ball, and nearby there was an orange felt pan, so the ball became an orange. I rolled another piece of dough to make a carrot shape, and then I made another roll green, healthy vegetables in a bowl. I wanted to get 2 more vegetables to make 5, but I ran out of time. A few days later, there was an article in the newspaper about the microplastics that are contained in school uniforms and that are inhaled by children. Most school uniforms, the article wrote, are made of polyester, the synthetic petroleum-derived fibre. When washed, they release microplastics, and these are particularly hard to remove from the environment and easily ingested by organisms across the food chain. My niggles about healthy eating messages and waste both came back into play. What is waste and what is wasteful became even more confused. And I also started to wonder, what is food? We consciously eat certain kinds of healthy food and we feel good, and even more so if we can get our children to eat them. But at the same time, what else are we eating, drinking, and breathing without meaning to? So harking back to this idea of the growing with that we talked about earlier, and Tim Ingold's comments about what is kind of taken in and let out again. So I hope that's given a little bit of a flavour of some of the different processes that we think are weaving themselves together during these workshops. There's the things that happen in the moment, and also there's the things people bring into the room with them around, for example, past childhood experiences, those snippets of like media coverage and rhetoric, the aspirations we have for childhood and the assumptions that we still bring with us. And then also collectively, what we bring together and what we might produce as new insights in the moment, working with our artists' invitations and with these kinds of prompts and ideas, and how we can use that to bridge arts with theory as well. So thinking here, of course, about theories of transcorporeality as well. So that's just giving you a little flavour of what some of these activities have looked like so far. I'm going to pass over to Jayne for some little concluding thoughts and what next.
Some inconclusive thoughts,
Yeah.
because it is very open. And as we said at the beginning, we're only partway through our project, but already, as you probably have a sense, it's generatively built upon a collective disquiet that we shared about the logic and hegemony of developmentalism and the way that it narrowly defines childhood. So it's been a really welcome opportunity to explore that through these arts-based methods and disquieting and discomforting bodily experiences. And specifically, we're concerned with the dominating figuration of the toddler as somehow a pesky age stage of willful defiance that must be controlled, must be normalized, must be endured. And our workshops have taken seriously the lived, embodied, effective materialization of toddlerhood in ways that defy linear development, agitating both discomfort and playful curiosity, as Christina's reflections there illustrate. So through arts-based methods, we've been afforded opportunities to dwell in porous thresholds where thinking otherwise is given space to breathe. At times we're overwhelmed and we are uncertain, but this is perhaps indicative of the generative potential we're hoping for that might come from placing ourselves in spaces of vulnerability to and relearn what we thought we knew about toddlerhood, and to contemplate what other possibilities might surface, and crucially what that might mean for contemporary childhoods, parenting and early childhood education more generally. And I'll stop there. I think we still have enough time for question and answer and discussion.
Yeah, and I think we can circulate these slides, but this is the website. So the website is not it's not kind of slick space, but it's more like a scrapbook where we're sharing reflections and thinking as we work through the different motifs. So what I read from Christina is on the website, along with lots of other pieces of writing from the team. Okay.
Thank you, Abby and Jayne.